As he mentioned, my name is Bob Allen. I'm a retired earth science teacher, taught for 34 years at Vernon, Verona, Sherrill, and then at New Hartford. And my background is in geology. I got my degree in geology from Hamilton College and my Master of Arts in Teaching in Geological Sciences. You may say, how did you ever get into coopering? I was, as part of my teaching, had to find something to do during the summer, so I worked as a park ranger at Fort Stanwix National Monument for 12 summers. And one of the rangers there had been doing coopering at the Erie Canal Village and said one day, anybody interested in learning how to use some of the equipment? She brought her equipment in, and I started learning how to do coopering. The first summer, it took me 10 weeks to make a bucket. And we had a dance out on the parade ground, of a ball with 18th century clothing. And it was in August. It was hot. It was dry. The parade ground was dirt. And it was dusty as all get out. And the bucket that I had made that looked similar to this leaked like a sieve. So we filled it with water, and I walked around the parade ground and watered it down, and that was my first working project that I did as a cooper. I got down to a point where I'm not quite as good as a cooper from the 18th century. They could make a bucket like that in about 2.5 hours. Wow. I can do one in about 2 days.
It doesn't leak?
It didn't when it was originally made. One of the things I found very quickly about coopering, you use them in the summertime, and then you stick them away for the winter in the barn or in the garage or somewhere in the house, and the wood shrinks, and the hoops loosen up. And I have one cask that I made that the hoops have slid down over 6 inches in about 10 years. And this one today would not hold water. What I need to do is put water in it, let it soak. I was doing that at one event. One of the things that I did as a reenactor was fire cannons. And you may say, why does this one have brass hoops on it? It's an artillery bucket. It's a naval artillery bucket for use in the Navy on shipboard to fire cannons. When we were up on the St. Lawrence River shooting cannons off the ship for one of the War of 1812 200th anniversary events. And I dipped it down into the river, set it down on the dock to let it swell. And the captain of the ship that we were working on came over and said, that's exactly the same thing we do with the ship in the spring. They pick it up, put it in the water, let it soak, and it absorbs a lot of the water, and it'll start to sink a little bit, and the bilge will fill up with water. And then they pump it out, and the wood swells, and it's nice and tight. So everything I've done in coopering, I've learned something new. One of the biggest and most fun things that I do is collecting tools. And I have quite a collection of antique and a few modern, but mostly antique tools from the mid-1700s, the mid-18th century, up to the 20th century, and some from the 21st century. But they're mostly 18th and 19th century materials. I do a number of programs for historical societies and groups like this and the Oneida County History Center. And last summer, I led a bicycle tour along the Erie Canal to take a look at the breweries here in Utica. There are over 30 different breweries at different times in Utica. There are about maybe 24, and they changed their names often. As soon as they were taken over by another owner or another brewer, they changed the name. And I was flipping through the pictures at the Oneida County History Center and found this one, and what a perfect one for a bicycle tour of the breweries along the canal. This is probably late 1800s, 1890s, early 1900s. You can see the bicycles, three ladies in their bicycling outfits with their boaters and skimmers on. Those are the hats. And I got looking a little closer at the picture, and I went, right behind them, you see all the wood that's stacked up. And the barrel right here. I'm not sure if that's a barrel or a hogshead. It looks pretty big. Excuse me. You may ask, aren't all these things barrels? No, a barrel is a very specific size. It's generally around 35 gallons, depending on what kind of material you put in it. And this is a half barrel or a kilderkin, and it holds about 15 gallons. The hogshead holds 60 gallons, very big. And a ton, really large cask, holds 250 gallons.
Wow.
They're generally used in the brewing industry. So what you see in this picture is the Erie Canal running through Utica, the towpath on either side of it, the cooper shop right here, the wood that gets collected, and they collect the wood usually about this time of year, January or February. The cooper will go outside, start cutting staves, and they'll cut billets. They'll split the wood, cut it into the lengths that they're going to be needing, and then stack them up to dry. And you can see those stacks right where the blue arrow is, and one of the casks right there. A cask is a generic term for what most people would call a barrel. Looking at some of the photographs from the Oneida County History Center, Patrick Reynolds got me onto this photograph of the staff and the workers at the West End Brewing Company, now Saranac. Went through a number of names. It was originally formed in 1888 by a gentleman named Bierbauer. And he hired a guy from Germany named FX Matt, who worked at the brewery as a brewmaster and then eventually took over the place, became president, and the family has owned that brewery since 1888. And this is in probably the late 1800s, around about the same time that the previous photograph was made. And I started looking at the staff here and trying to figure out what everybody did. Up in the Rome Historical Society, I got into a ledger book for the Evans and Guile brewery and realized that there are a lot of people that go into a brewing business. And you can recognize some of the people here. This guy right here with a hammer on his lap and probably a hoop driver right there. And this guy right here, and quite possibly this guy may have been coopers. They produced several thousand gallons of beer a year, and each one had to have its own container, either a full keg, half keg, or quarter keg. Full keg sold for $5 up until about 1910. A half keg like this would be $2.50.
Full?
Full of beer, yeah, with beer in it. And the quarter keg, which I remember buying those after I got out of college and when I was in the fire department in Deansboro, it was $1.25. Not when I bought them, but in the 1800s. This fellow right here is a teamster. He would haul the wagons of beer to the saloons, hotels, restaurants, and they would sell half kegs like this. And do you recognize anybody else in that picture? My wife was kind enough to put a more recent cooper in, You may recognize that guy right there. He's an extra Cooper that kind of joined the company later on. This is probably the owner. That may be one of the Matts. And this is probably a co-owner or one of the main clerks, one of the business directors, the CEO, or one of the financial officers. We have laborers and probably salesmen. And here's another teamster that hauled beer around, and then the day laborers and a little errand guy down here that would go and take orders from the various establishments that were consuming their beer. In the early 20th century, they still made wooden kegs. This lumber is about 1 3/4 to 2 inches thick, and it's a real job to make these things and heat them and draw them in tight. But this is one of the early West End Brewing Company casks. And here are a pair of Coopers up at the Copper City Brewery up in Rome. And I'm repairing one of the Fort Stanwix casks that they have at their collection in the brewery there. There are a couple of different kinds of Coopers. There's the tight Cooper that makes things that contain liquids, and then there's the slack Cooper that it isn't tight, it won't hold liquids. Well, if it does, it works like my bucket that I use to water the parade ground. But the slack Cooper would make containers for shoes, clothing, nails, flour. They would line the inside of the slack barrel with paraffin or cotton or some other kind of cloth, and would ship the goods in slack barrels. The tight barrels have to be watertight. They may be lined with brewer's pitch. Brewer's pitch is a material that you take pine sap, boil off the volatiles, the turpentine and things, and you end up with a material that looks and feels very much like beeswax, but has a higher melting point, and you can use that to line the inside of your cask with it. The white Cooper does materials for the household, for milk, water, butter, cheese, things like that. And that doesn't impart the tannins into the goods if it's made of spruce or hemlock or white fir or pine. The wet Cooper would generally work with white oak. That's one of the favored materials for the brewer. And the cask that was there would have been made of white oak. And these are some of the containers that I've made over the years. This is on the well out in front of my former home on Skyline Drive in Deansboro. And my daughter and her husband have taken over the farm, and we moved down off the hill into a place that doesn't have the wind and doesn't have the snow, and it's kind of delightful. But you can see the white of the materials, and over time they'll age. And remember I was talking about the one that the hoops dropped about 6 inches? That's that cask right there. And you can see the line at the top where it was originally where the hoops were. And as the wood would shrink, the hoops slid down. Now, if your hoops slide down on a container like this, it will tighten up. If the hoops slide down on the bottom part of a cask with a belly on it, they'll slide off.
Yeah.
So that keeps the Cooper in business. He has to keep tightening those up. But when you have something like this that's narrow at the top and wider at the bottom, that's a bucket. A pail is wider at the top and narrower at the bottom. Didn't know there was a difference. I didn't know there was until I started coopering. But when you go out and you buy a plastic pail, take a look, it's wider at the top and narrower at the bottom. But a slop bucket or a water bucket that you use out in the barn or swabbing the decks on the ship, the water doesn't splash out as much.
Can you hold that up so we can see it?
Yes, I'm sorry. Well, actually, you can see some, that's the same one right
okay.
there.
All right.
And it's wide at the bottom, narrow at the top. These two with the flowers in them, these are narrow at the bottom and wider at the top. And they're great for putting mums in the fall. I have about over half a dozen that I use.
Did you make the ones in this, on the photo on the right?
All of the ones in the photos, yep. This one I made for a toy store down in Oneonta called Monkey Barrel Toys. And they filled it up with stuffed sock monkeys. That's a bucket. That's a pail. That's a butter churn. It's just a long, narrow bucket with a dasher in it. The dasher, you can move up and down and churn the butter. The largest object I ever made was this wash tub right here for a friend in the reenacting community. And she used it as a wash tub for washing clothes at 18th century events. She literally would gather the laundry from the soldiers that were there for the event, would wash them, and then hang them out to dry. That holds 17 gallons. And it's about a little more than 3 feet tall and about 3 feet across the top, the diameter of it. And you fill that with water, and that gets pretty heavy. This one is another fellow reenactor, Dave Manthe, from the 2nd Albany, and he portrays a peddler. And he's delivering containers that could have clothing, shoes, nails, or wine, beer, spirits, depending on whether they're tight or slack.
Those
Cooperage.
ones on the right are narrow at the top and the bottom.
Yes.
So what are they called?
That's a cask.
Oh, got it.
Let me just set this down for a minute. And here's an example of one of those.
Oh, okay.
Wider in the middle, narrower top and bottom. And you make the staves slightly differently. You start out with a rectangular piece of wood and shave it down, and this one is a little narrower at the top and narrower at the bottom, and you shave these down, and that's what gives it its belly.
What kind of wood are you using for the wash tub? What's the wood?
Again, I typically use, because it's easier to get a hold of and easier to work with, that's made of white pine.
Oh.
I have done some goods, this one is made of white oak. It's a much harder wood to use, and you have to have your tools extremely sharp, which you generally have to do anyway.
Hey, Bob,
Yes,
the guy on the right with the 3 casts, it seems like even empty, those would weigh quite a bit. I can't imagine having anything substantial inside of them, walking around
I can't
very
either.
far as a peddler. I mean, what are you talking, like 250 pounds on a guy's back?
quite possibly, yeah, well, let's see. This one would probably be about 7 gallons, I guess.
Oh my God, 7 gallons?
So if it were filled with water or a little less for beer, that'd be, what, 56 pounds?
That's just for one.
Yeah.
And that doesn't include the weight of the wood.
On if you're using pine or something like that, it's not very heavy. If you're using white oak, that gets pretty hefty. But, you know, these guys were delivering things and they were doing this all the time. Now, if it were full of clothing,
Right.
it wouldn't weigh nearly as much. If it were full of nails, it'd be a lot heavier.
Yeah.
I couldn't lift it if it was full of nothing.
Yeah. Oh, they're not bad.
Why didn't they put those on a wagon instead of carrying them on their backs? Since they make
It's,
things. I
it's
don't
what
care.
you got. If you have the wagon and the horse,
No,
you
just
do it.
to make them be
Yeah, you're right, it's not.
it's not very heavy. It's surprisingly, pretty light. I have no idea what the weight of this is. But this would be for short term, for short distances. They'd bring them to you on a wagon or a cart, or you could have a push cart. But the way the roads and stuff were in the days, in the 1700s and 1800s, it's easier just to throw it on your back.
He looks like he could put another one on the top because of the rock, but
Um,
it's spaced up at the top of it.
yeah, there is a little more space up there. You could put other goods, like a couple blankets on top if you needed to. And this is based on a painting from the 18th century, from the 1700s.
Of the guy who died young.
Well, most of them did. The average age was generally in the 40s, but if you made it that far, you could live well into your 80s.
All or nothing.
That was the largest cask that I've made. This kind of thing is the smallest. It's a little mug, a container for coffee, for beer, spirits. And the original, this one right here, is in the New Bedford Whaling Museum in Massachusetts. I looked at it, saw it in the display there, talked with a colleague of mine who worked at the Farmers Museum down in Cooperstown, and it's made of white oak, has hoops top and bottom, and an extra hoop on the bottom. And I said, I think I could make one of those. So I got the spec sheet from the museum. This friend of mine used to work there, and got a hold of the folks. They sent me the specification sheet. It's made of white oak, gave me the dimensions, height, width, diameter, and I reproduced one with 2 hoops on the bottom, 1 hoop here, and I was trying to figure out why it had 2 hoops on the bottom. And then one day I was looking at my cooper's bench, and my mug fell over. And it landed right on the bottom. Why? More weight. So the extra hoops on the bottom were so you could be on a ship, and the ship would be rocking back and forth, and it would hold its position. The extra weight.
So is your reproduction about the same size as the original?
It's exactly the same height, same diameter, same materials. Yeah, so I don't know if one was stretched out in the presentation, but the sizes are identical. It's the same height.
Wow.
So how wide were the pieces of wood that you used to make that mug?
Those were about, maybe 1.5 inches, less than 2 inches. The ones up here, these are 2 to 2.5, 2 to 3 inches. Let's see, this one, yeah, that's just a little over 1 inch. They're just a little over 1 inch. To start out, as I was mentioning, to make the staves, I can go to the sawmill, and I do some work at Hanford Mills down in East Meredith, New York. And they have a sawmill, a working sawmill that's run by a water wheel. And the sawyer there, the fellow that cuts the wood, cuts the blanks for me. And I tell him, I say, Rob, I want so many of this size. And he gives me the rectangular wood, and he generally tries to get them quarter sawn. Here's the quarter sawn wood. You cut the log into quarters and then saw each quarter so that the grain of the wood goes vertically. And that's what most coopers use, especially for tight goods. If you go to the sawmill or you go to the lumber yard and you just get straight plain sawn wood, you'll have grains going in all sorts of different directions. And they leak more. It's great for slack coopering, but for tight coopering, you want quarter sawn oak. And I could split it with the fro. This is a curved fro, very specific for coopering. Or you can use a straight fro. I have another one that's just, instead of having a curve on this, it's straight. You can just cut billets like that.
Is a fro a saw?
No, it's like a knife blade.
Okay.
And you hammer down the top
Oh,
and
it's
it
a
splits the wood.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I didn't bring my straight fro.
Do you hammer on either side of the edges that stick out?
No, well, yeah, I start hammering here, and then you just hammer down here, hammer on this side, yeah. And once it starts to split, it usually goes pretty quickly. Especially if you're using nice straight grain wood. Ash works very well, and ash is a very good coopering material. Then once I get those staves, I get them cut or split, then I can go to the joiner or the plane. It's a great big long, almost 5 feet long floor plane. Just an inverted floor plane. I don't know if you're familiar with a floor plane, but you know what a straight plane is, just a flat plane. Just turn it upside down. It's got 2 blades. This one has one here, one here. Most of them just have 1 blade. But this one has a double-throated Cooper's joiner. And to make the joints, we bevel the angle. We bevel the edge so that they'll all fit together and form a curved shape. If you do it on a straight edge, you just get like a box. If you do it on a angle,
Yeah.
it'll start to approach a curve.
Ah.
And that's what you have to do for each of the staves to get the curve.
What's the degree of the curve?
That's just what I was gonna ask.
It varies. The question was, what's the degree of the curve? And this angle varies with the number of staves. So the Coopers were familiar with mathematics. This one, I believe, is a 16 stave bucket. 16 into 360 is 20 degrees. That's the angle from the center to each side. So here would be the center, and this total angle would be 20 degrees. So half of that would be 10 degrees. So this angle right here is 80 degrees. And I have a number of templates or pieces of wood that are cut to that curvature or that angle so I can check my work. When you start out, you have to keep checking it pretty regularly, but after 20 some years of doing this, I can come out to within a degree or two of what I want depending on the number of staves.
If you want it to be a curve on both ends, you do that after? You don't do it at the same time, right? Like first you get that angle, and then afterwards you take some off the top and the bottom.
Right, right, and my guide on that is making the staves the same width at the top and bottom.
Excellent.
So the center, the belly of the barrel or cask would be about 3 inches, and the top would be about 2 to 2.5. Again, depending on the size I'm working on.
Did they ever do tongue and groove joints?
In the late 19th and early 20th century, when they were starting to make staves by machine,
Yeah.
yes. But the
What was
Cooper,
his question?
the question was, did they ever use tongue and groove? In fact, if you look
Oh,
at
yeah.
more modern buckets and casks, you'll find tongue and groove very commonly. Those are machine made. They're not handmade. And the coopering that I do is all hand coopering. Well, I'll take that back, not quite all. In 1840, a gentleman down in Oneonta invented a heading machine to make the pieces of wood to put in the heads. The head is the top or the bottom of the cask. And that heading machine could make a head by water power and a knife blade that would spin a block of wood around or a piece of wood around and trim it down, and it would take about 1.5 minutes to make it. For me to do it by hand, it would take me between a half an hour and 1 hour and 15 minutes, depending on the size, how many pieces I had to use. So, yeah, most of what I do is hand coopering, but the machine stuff, did make some differences. And today, if you go up to the cooperage up in Remsen, and I'm not sure if they're still there or not. They are? No, they're not. Okay, I heard they were moving to Schoharie sometime last summer. And that cooperage does most of their work by machine. And all the staves are machine cut. They're all exactly the same. Many of them are tongue and groove. But hand coopering is a little bit more skill, but not quite as precise.
How do you put the handles on there? Are they part of one of the staves?
Yeah, it's just a longer
Longer
stave and
stave,
just
okay.
drill a hole with
Right.
the bracing bit.
Because it's hard for me to see that from here.
Here I am working with the curved draw knife to hollow the inside, to put the curvature on that stave. I don't know if you can see it from the back, but this one is curved. Here, this end's better. Excuse me.
Yeah.
You can see the curve on the inside,
Yeah.
and then you flip it over and take a straight knife and trim the back. And that's what I'm doing over here, trimming the back of it to get the curvature. And I use the cooper's horse to hold the goods with my feet. It's like a lever, like a vise, and I press down on the pedals down here, and the head moves toward me and closes down on top of the wood so that I don't have to use my hands. I can use both hands on the draw knife.
Did you have to build that horse?
Yes, well, I didn't have to, but yes, I did. This one right here is one that's in the Oneida County History Center collection. That is from the Eagle Brewery right here in Utica. This is one I made at Sturbridge Village, Old Sturbridge Village.
Oh, yeah.
I took a weekend workshop and made that by hand, drilled the holes with a big T auger, yes, thanks, and drilled that down. And the hardest thing I've ever done as a cooper, and the hardest part of that project, was cutting the cheeks on this side, because it's narrower up here and wider where I sit. And used a rip saw to cut, not across the grain, but with the grain. And that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Oh, I did want to mention, this is at the Farmers Museum, out on the front lawn of the Bump Tavern. And it was a real honor to work down there, and I've been down there every year for their Harvest Festival for several years. The Bump Tavern used to be in Windham, New York. Back in the 1950s, it was moved to Cooperstown piece by piece. It was originally built by Ezekiel Tuttle. My wife's maiden name is Tuttle. Her father used to visit his Uncle Frank and Aunt Lucy Bump at this tavern down in Windham, New York. So that's my wife's great Uncle Frank and great Aunt Lucy's house. And it's a real honor to sit on their front lawn and do coopering demonstrations. In fact, I have his butter press that says FB, Frank Bump. These are some of the tools that I use. Here's the straight froe right here. That's the straight froe. There's the curved froe. I have hoop drivers, different styles of hoop drivers for driving the hoops down. Set this right on there, take a hammer and just drive that down and tighten it up. And it's the pressure of the hoops that holds everything together. This, I believe, was a brewer's hoop driver. And again, this goes down on top of the hoops, and I drive that down with a hammer.
Where do the hoops come from?
I buy the steel, just straight strips of steel, like this right here, from the blacksmith. I go down to Sherburne Steel, and I get a 4x8 sheet of steel cut into 1-inch strips. It's 16 gauge, and I make all my own hoops.
Wow.
I have a small anvil, just about big enough for dropping on roadrunners. And I use my hammers, and I use a cold chisel to cut it. So I don't have to heat it and cut it. Everything I do is cold. And I drive rivets into the hoops. And you can see the rivet right here. It's pretty small. You can see it a little bit better on this one right here. You can see the two rivets right there. Usually put 2 rivets in for strength.
Is that copper?
Brass.
Brass, okay, brass.
Why would I use brass?
It doesn't rust.
It won't rust. I can use this on shipboard
Yeah.
and it won't create a spark. So this is perfect for an artillery bucket.
Wow.
No spark, no rust, use it on ship.
I'm surprised when you ride it down with all the force that you're not worried about those rivets popping back out.
No, they're pretty strong, yeah. And, well, the force is not directly outward.
Right, it's,
Most of the force goes downward and it tends to spread. Another thing we do is we hammer the hoop steel, and here's a piece of the hoop steel. I hammer this on one side. And if I hammer just one side of it, what happens when you hammer the steel? It does what?
Hardens?
Not so much it hardens, it actually makes it a little bit more pliable, and it starts to spread.
Is it dimples?
It'll dimple, and it'll start to spread so that it's narrower at the top and a little wider at the bottom. And that allows the hoops to fit down on the angle. Remember I said this is narrower at the top and wider at the bottom. And you can see, I don't know if, I'll bring this around. You can see where it's been fullered or hammered to spread and fit that taper.
So how do you do it when it's wider at the top and narrower at the bottom?
Oh, turn it upside down.
Okay.
Yeah, just, they're exactly the same thing. They're made exactly the same way. And you just decide, okay, I'm going to put the not wide spot at the top and the wide spot at the bottom. And you make a tail or a button.
there must be some.
Why was that one piece loose? Because of the age?
Wood shrinks. Yeah. And if I take a hoop driver and hammer, just push that down, it tightens it right up. Yeah. And if you need to replace something, you just take a hammer, drive the hoop, take the hoop off,
I want to touch this.
and as long as,
Wow.
yeah, as long as there's one hoop on it, it's gonna hold everything in place. And it's the pressure of the hoops that makes it tight and holds everything together. No glue.
You have a preference on which end you do first? Would you do the wider end first?
It depends on what kind of raising up hoop I have. I just check to see, I measure it, and then I'll put a temporary hoop on it. And I'm trying to think, so I know sometimes I use the top hoop, sometimes I use the bottom hoop. Doesn't make any difference. And sometimes when I raise it up, I'll just put hoop in the middle and then make the hoop for the top and hoop for the bottom. Generally, you put the wider one on first and then the narrower one, especially when you're doing a cast.
Do you ever have to use shims?
I can use flagging, use cattail fronds, dried cattail fronds. I can place those in between the staves, and they act as a gasket. When they get wet, they swell. And that'll take care of some of the mistakes in the wood or mistakes that Cooper made.
Bob,
Yeah.
was coopering a prestigious profession like glass blowing? And when the industrial era started, did they all lose their jobs? Mechanization?
Let me answer that in a couple of parts. Coopers were generally middle-class artisans. They made fairly good money, especially as a wet cooper. A tight cooper or a wet cooper would make 2 to 3 times as much money as a dry cooper. One of the coopers in the western part of New York in the 1800s, actually about the time of the end of the Civil War, the 1860s, was charging 25 cents for a bucket like that. 25 cents. But in the 1860s, that was a pretty good income.
Could buy a pound of hamburger for a penny, right?
I have no idea what a pound of meat would cost at that time, but yeah, in the
25 cents.
around 1911, the brewers up in Rome were making $5,000 to $8,000, I think. And the coopers, and again, they were selling their beer for $5 a barrel.
Yeah.
That would be equal to about 1.2 million today, their total yearly profit. So the brewers were making pretty good money, and the brewers relied on the coopers. So the coopers were middle class. They weren't poor, but they weren't the owners.
Was it 5,000 the annual salary for one brewer? Or for the
No,
whole
that
brewery?
was the money that the
whole
most
brewery.
profit for the
For the whole brewery.
Whole brewery, yeah, yeah. Yes,
How did Cooperstown get its name?
apparently James Fenimore Cooper had a predecessor that made
Was it
barrels
Cooper?
and buckets.
So he was. his
It
family
wasn't
Cooper.
him, but the family name was Cooper, just like Cooper Street out behind here.
Yeah.
I tried to look to see if that was actually where there was a cooperage, and it wasn't. It was named after a family.
Okay.
Bob, there's a lady over there.
What's that, the chamfer knife?
Yes,
Which one is that, what does that look like?
that's a chamfer knife.
Okay.
And this is for hollowing the inside. She asked what a chamfer knife was and what it's used for. This is for the inside of the cask. And I can also trim the edges at the top by running this around the top. Put one part inside and hold it with one hand and drag it around the top. And you'll notice one goes one way, one goes the other way. Is one for a left-handed cooper? No. In the 18th century, you weren't left-handed or right-handed. You were right-handed. And all of the tools were made for right-handed, but it goes for the grain of the wood. You don't work against the grain, you work generally with the grain. So you have tools that can go either way. I could go this way around the cask, or I could go this way around the cask.
My question, so the hoops were riveted together, but they weren't actually fastened to the wood?
Correct, correct. It's just the pressure that holds the hoops in place. His question was, were there any nails or anything that held these in place? Occasionally,
Maybe they leak.
I'll use a hoop nail, like I have right here. There's a little tiny flat-sided nail that goes in, and they'll use these on the hoops to keep them from sliding down.
His name's Bob, right?
Hey, Bob,
Yes.
The more you talk, the more I wonder how you keep your tools so sharp. As it's clear they have to be sharp.
Winter. In the summer, I use them. In January and February, I go down in the shop or out in the shop in the barn, and I spend hours sharpening tools.
well,
And while I'm working with them during the summer, I'll have my whetstone and I'll have a leather strop that I use to keep them sharp. It's just like keeping your razor sharp. I had an uncle who used to use a straight razor all the time, and he was constantly sharpening it.
That's just what I want to do in January, be in a cold barn sharpening.
In my garage now, I've got a pellet stove out in the garage, and in the barn up at the farm, we had anywhere from 4 to a dozen horses in the barn, and they keep it much more comfortable. And you're out of the wind, and you're working on things, and it's really not all that bad. And these are some of the tools. Again, this is a crow's and we'll take a closer look at that in a minute. And that's what cuts the groove to put the head in. That's what keeps the head in place. Cutting the groove and sliding the head, the wooden round part, down into that groove, and then tightening up the hoops. And they may be drilled and pegged to keep them from sliding apart. And here you can see the sawtooth blade on the crows. It's just an old file that's been turned into a saw blade. And this one over here is a chisel crows, a little bit fancier kind of crows. The one on top is the sawtooth. The one on the bottom is a chisel crows. And the one on the bottom is one of the prettiest tools that I've ever found. Got it at the Mohawk Valley Antique Fair several years ago. Here you can see the saw blade, and here you can see the chisel teeth.
And you just set that on and rotate it around
Yep.
and around, it cuts the groove.
Yep.
That's amazing.
And typically what I learned to do is turn the cask on its side and then run this around like this.
Oh, yeah.
It makes it easier than trying to do it from the top. The biggest one of these I've ever seen was one for making a ton, a TUN, 250 gallons. And this is the chisel crows, this is the sawtooth crows. And that one was probably 4 feet across. This is to cut the groove in the top of the cask. Yep. Yep, this sits down on the top, you just run it around the top or put it down on the
Where's the
inside.
sharp object that actually cuts it?
That's the saw blade right there, that's the sawtooth crows, and that's the chisel crows right there. Yep. Oh, you're welcome.
You would use that on the bottom also, to put a groove in for the bottom part of the spur.
Yeah, yeah, it doesn't make any difference whether it's the top or the bottom, they're both called heads. It's a two-headed container, and depending on how you put it in,
Cut it with wood. It will take them a while.
I had hoped to get to some of the other research that I've done and some of the other tools that I've made. This is a drawing of a windlass to help draw those staves in. And there's the reproduction that I made. The rope goes around here, winds on here, rope comes through this side, and draws it right in. Today they use hydraulics and wires to just pull them right in so that you can put the hoops on.
How long does it take to do that? I mean, without, it wouldn't break, the staves wouldn't break, it's a, how long is the process?
If they're made well, yeah, they shouldn't break. If they've got knots and things in them, yeah, they will split, and then you gotta start over on that stave again. And here we are down at the Hanford Mills Museum. It's usually a job for 2 coopers or more, and we're doing a cast class. And here's the winch that I was using, the one I just showed you. You heat the inside. You take the shavings that you produce and burn them and heat it up, and the lignin in the wood begins to flow so that you can draw it together. And this whole process, doing it out on the driveway here, probably took us 20 minutes, half an hour. So it's not too long.
Do you have a little winch for your mugs?
No, but there are a number of things you can use. I just take a piece of rope around it like a tourniquet, or I'll use a raising up hoop. I have a couple of hoops that I've made that are specifically that size to start them, and I can put them together and just drive them down and tighten them up. How did I find the Coopers here in Oneida County? Looked at a lot of maps. Oren Foote was in Deansboro, just down the hill from where I used to live. And where would these guys have their shops? Well, right here's the railroad, New York and Oswego Railroad. And here's Route 315. Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. This is in Yeah, this is in Deansboro. And here's the railroad, here's the Shenango Canal. And the cooperage was right here. It says OF foot CSH, Cooper Shop.
Oh,
And if you look at the maps, you may not always know what it stands for. BSH, Blacksmith Shop. Some of them may be grist mills, GM, grist mill, sawmill, things like that. Here's another one in Vernon, and the street right here is called Cooper Street. And Vernon used to have a whole bunch of mill ponds. Now, a lot of breweries were built near those for a source of ice and for a source of transportation. Hazard and Son in Oriskany Falls, not far from where I live, was on Hazard Street. Today, that's known as Cooper Street. Why? Because that's where his cooperage was. And this is one of the few buildings that is still around today. This is Cooper Street. That building right there is now an apartment building, and that was Hazard's Cooper Shop.
oh,
He and his sons did coopering there. In Rome, Wood Creek, Mohawk River, Erie Canal. Most of the breweries, the Red Stars, that's where the Coopers were near for most men. It wasn't always breweries that the Coopers were making barrels for. Everything was shipped in casks. But the populated areas where the work was, that was all along the transportation routes, the canals and the rivers. Yes.
Bob, I'm trying to picture this. Let's say you have a tight cask that's full of beer, has heads at each end.
Yep.
When I want to open it, how do I open it?
When we were kids, we used to see them all go in with a hatchet and just split the top. That's not how you do it. You loosen up the hoops and slide it off if you're taking out clothing or shoes or nails. If you're filling a cask, you got to make it tight first. So then you drill a hole in one side on one stave, turn that toward the top, fill it, and then drive a bung in, a cork.
Oh, okay.
And then when you're ready to serve it, you stand it up on end, drill a hole in the end, and put a spigot in it.
Okay.
And then you lay it over on its side, and it'll drain out on the lower part and pour out the spigot.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Irishman. Kelly and Gaheen ran a brewery in Rome, one of the most successful ones in Rome. In the census records, you can find him and his family. And for one of the presentations that I did at Rome, found the picture of Gaheen and his son, Simon, this young lad right here, took over the business when Dad died. And then these are, and they're going to be really hard to see from where you're sitting. If you want to see them in more detail, I have hard copies up here. These are brewers coopers in the city of Rome. Pretty good number of them. This is the Kelly and Gaheen Brewery, so it had a pretty good sized staff. And these are coopers in southern Oneida County. Oriskany Falls, Deansboro, Waterville, Forge Hollow, Salzville, Madison, Sangerfield, Marshall, Clinton. This is the Utica street map. I used this on my bicycle tour. And here you can see the Erie Canal, the Mohawk River right here, the railroads, the Shenango Canal, which goes right where the arterial is today, and the creek that comes from the east that you can't see anymore. It is now under the roads and parks and Yes,
On your previous two slides, when you said Coopers in Rome, the people with the last name Cooper or
No.
making barrels?
these are people that made barrels. Yeah, they all have different names, and I don't think any of them were named Cooper. I think they were all working coopers that made barrels and casks.
Like now, or is that, I didn't catch the date, is it historic?
Those were generally from 1820 to 1880. And we have another one here. This is Utica. Oops, I'm sorry, that's Southern Oneida County. These, oops, I'm going the wrong way.
There you go.
And we're back. I identified 22 Irish coopers.
Just for today.
And, no, I was doing that for this location. And in the census records, they list their place of birth and their parents' place of birth. All of these are immigrants from Ireland or first-generation Americans whose parents were raised and born in Ireland. That's 22 out of about, or excuse me, 25, yeah, 22 out of about 53.
That's a good proportion.
Yes, in most of the areas, the number of Irish Coopers were between 12 and 30%. Here in Utica, of the ones that I found, and this is not a scientific study, this is just from census data and from maps, and I identified about 42 to 47% of the Coopers were Irish.
Did a lot of them come over in the famine era?
Almost all of them arrived between 1820 and 1900. And somebody just mentioned she's Irish and German. I'm Irish and German. My great-grandfather was from County Tyrone near Omagh in Northern Ireland. And my other side of the family, my dad's side, was from Saxony. But he wasn't a cooper, he was a gunsmith. My Irish ancestor from down from Northern Ireland. But you may recognize some of the names, which are probably hard to see from there. McQuaid.
Yeah.
Michael McQuaid was from Ireland and was a cooper. They eventually went into business, distilling, and running a brewery. And these are the wards. The first ward right along the Mohawk River, the fifth ward along Baloo Creek on the east side of town, along the Erie Canal, and Ward 6 along the Erie Canal. This is where most of the Irish Coopers lived. Remember, they were generally within walking distance of work, and they had to be close to where their skills were needed. And that's another future investigation to find out where the Irish immigrants were living, and was it simply because of the job? Was it because of the cost of housing? There are an awful lot of questions about those Irish Coopers. And where did they ship their stuff? One of the places, one of their favorites was Baggs Square. This is one of my favorite pictures of Baggs Square.
Wow. What year was
This is shortly after 1855. There's the early train. This is where the Union Station is today.
Wow.
And this is Genesee Street going up that way.
Yeah.
And here's Main Street right here. And this is the cooperage in Hutton's Brewery over by Baloo Creek on the east side of town. And you can see the number of coopers and workers that they have in there and the casks that they're making.
With the holes.
Yeah, yeah, there's a bung hole right there. Yep, they're ready to be filled. And they test it with water first, and then they can make repairs, put flagging in, or put brewer's pitch in if they have to.
I don't believe they drank beer cold in those days. It was warm, it had to be, right?
One of the reasons why the breweries were where they were is because of the availability of water to make the beer. And this time of year, they put ice in ice houses. Every brewery had an ice house.
Oh, did they?
So they did keep the beer cold for production, and generally try to keep it cool for a short period of time while it was at the establishment. But it generally wasn't served as cold as we drink it today. And I know I'm running a little bit late, but two Coopers and the work that they do, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. Yeah, and in the 18th century, you didn't smile for your pictures. And this is a tintype that was made by a gentleman named Gray at the Farmers Museum. And that's my colleague Nate. He's a Mohawk Indian. And myself, we do coopering together. And where'd you get the stuff to make the beer?
Yeah.
Hops from southern Oneida County and Madison County. It was the hop capital of the world.
My great-great-grandfather, uncle.
And I thank you, and I know you've been asking questions.